Hello, my name is Hassan Sorrells, and this is the Leadership Lessons from the Great Books podcast, episode number 18, with my returning guest today from episode number 5 or 6, I believe, might be 7 or 8. Y'all can go back and
I
look.
thought it was -1.
It might have been -1. Dorollo Nixon Jr. Hello, Dorollo.
Hello, Hassan.
He's back. He's got his coffee. He's fortified in a Starbucks cup.
Yep, Detroit.
Unlike myself,
Breakfast of Champions, Detroit.
I have a glowing gray cup here because I'm not going for any of that Starbucks nonsense. But anyway, that's all right. We will forgive Dorollo today because he's and Starbucks and Howard Schultz, the house that Howard Schultz built. We're not going to get into all that because today we are going to be talking about, and we're going to hear Dorollo's comments on this book that I'm holding up right here. If you're watching the video, you'll be able to see it. If you're listening to this on audio, well, you're just going to wait for me to say the title. From A Moveable Feast by Ernest Hemingway. We're going to read directly from the introduction to start. Now, this introduction, this foreword, was written by his son, Patrick Hemingway. I don't remember which wife goes with which kid on this one, so forgive me. There's two Hemingways who write both the foreword and the introduction to this restored edition of A Moveable Feast, which has Ernest Hemingway's photo on it from when he was a stunningly beautiful young man. Not an old man of the sea, Nobel Prize winning old man. So from the foreword, from A Moveable Feast. Now, what can I say about the title? Mary Hemingway derives it from a remark made by her husband to Aaron Hotchner. Quote, "If you are lucky enough to have lived in Paris as a young man, then wherever you go for the rest of your life, it stays with you, for Paris is a movable feast." When my father was free to marry my mother, Pauline, there you go, Pauline and Patrick, he agreed to convert to Roman Catholicism and undergo a course of religious instruction in Paris. Hemingway, of course, as a boy, had received quite a bit of religious instruction as a properly brought up Protestant, but he had received the sacrament of last rites from a Catholic chaplain in the battlefield dressing station during the night after his mortar wound on the Italian front. And like the famous French king whose statue he mentions in the Paris memoir, he knew that Pauline was worth a mass. The complexity of a movable feast lies in the calculation of the calendar date for Easter in a given year, from which it is simple enough then to assign a calendar date to each and every movable feast for a given year. Now, this paragraph is in reference to the concept of a movable feast that the priest, most likely from Saint-Sulpice, the church where Pauline attended services near her Paris apartment, talked about what the nature of a movable feast actually meant in Catholicism with Hemingway. Palm Sunday is 7 days before Easter. Once again, from the back end of the foreword from Patrick Hemingway. In later life, the idea of a movable feast for Hemingway became something very much like what King Harry wanted St. Crispin's feast day to be for, quote unquote, we happy few, a memory or even a state of being that had become a part of you, a thing that you could always have with you, no matter where you went or how you lived forever that after, that you could never lose. Fundamentally, so much has been written and filmed and examined about Hemingway, particularly, I would say, in the last 40 years of literature, film, and television. Dorollo even asked me today, before we cut on, if we were going to talk about the movies, either A Midnight in Paris or that HBO thing that came out a few years ago. And we are fundamentally a literature podcast, so we don't get into film criticism here. We don't talk about films, although I would love to do a film podcast, Leadership Lessons from the Great Films, because there are great lessons you can learn from great films, and perhaps there are lessons you can learn from Hemingway-oriented films. But Owen Wilson's going to have to take a back seat to us today. And instead, we're going to put Hemingway forward, as people have relentlessly done, but hopefully in a different kind of way, because it is impossible, really, to say anything new about Hemingway, about his writing, about his life, and particularly about his death by suicide. We are going to focus, because this is a leadership podcast today, on how do you grow in self-awareness? How do you sharpen that tool? What can the essays that we've picked today from Moveable Feast to talk about, what can those essays help us discover as leaders about sharpening and defining and documenting the truth and walking the line? And I think this is critical. This is what Hemingway did through his entire career. Walking the line between what the truth is according to you and what the truth is according to the person you are selling out. And as we know, and I'll mention this later on from an earlier podcast where we talked about Joan Didion's writing in Slouching Towards Bethlehem, she infamously said that writers are always selling someone out. And I fundamentally believe that they are. And when leaders engage in self-reflection, they are always selling someone out. So we're going to start on this road. We're going to start going down this road by talking with Dorollo. And he's a good friend of the podcast. This is why we wanted him back on the show. Him, along with Dave Baumrucker, a couple of others, have been really good guests. And so we are doing a tight guest rotation here, bringing in people who can talk with us about these books and pull some tropes, some ideas, some thoughts out for leaders, lay them out on the table, and then drop the mic and walk away like in that Obama meme. He was at the national, I believe it was the prayer breakfast or whatever it was. He dropped the mic, and Dorollo was laughing.
He liked dropping things and walking away.
And that's about as political as we're going to get at this point on the podcast.
Detroit.
Skull into your health. We're not Glenn Lowry and John McWhorter. We're not that podcast. We don't do that. Those guys seem to have that niche, although we were talking about doing a different type of podcast that might wander in that direction. Maybe we'll double the McWhorter and Lowry on the next show, and we'll maybe launch another brand that way. All right, enough talking about launching brands. Dorollo, how you doing today? You have anything to say to the folks before we jump in? Anything to say to the folks about self-awareness or the writing of Ernest Hemingway to get us started here today? Because I've been yammering for a while.
Yes, you have. So the first thing is an ironic comment, not to trust self-awareness in writing. And here's my analogy. If you imagine a stand-up comedian like Jerry Seinfeld doing his thing, or Jamie Foxx or Eddie Murphy or any of these great comedians doing their thing.
Dave Chappelle. Yes.
Chris Rock.
Okay. Well, are we talking pre-incident or post-incident?
You mentioned incident, not me.
I didn't say which incident. I could be talking about divorce. I could be talking about anything.
Fair enough. Yes, he may have other incidents than the incident. But it could just kind of be like Batman, where they're before or after meeting that man in the alley. And there may just be one incident only, but hopefully not, because he's a great comedian. No one, I hope, would be fooled into thinking that stand-up comedy is ad hominem.
No, I would hope not.
First, people work through it. The comedians work through it. They know their jokes. They've been through these routines. And so, pun intended, it's staged, right? So if they're sharing their hearts or being, self-reflective, okay, communicating some kind of self-awareness, that it's rehearsed, it's practiced, it's thought through. A fortiori, one of the favorite expressions I learned in law school for self-awareness in writing. In the Fitzgerald essay, as I'm sure you're going to talk about, Ernest Hemingway talked about how much work he put in just to making a paragraph. And so thus, when I encounter self-reflection in Hemingwayan prose, I know that it's not ad hominem, that he's thought it through and revised and cut and rewritten and revised and cut and rewritten. And thus, on the one hand, it is possible that it is not self-awareness at all. It is completely canned. At the same time, it is possible that he may have distilled some truth. And in those moments when he does, it resonates. And one of the things that's eerie about when it resonates in Hemingway is when it resonates early. Because then it was a young man who could say something and wrote something that hadn't been written, that told a truth, that impacted people's lives and will continue to. And that was something apparently he knew.
Now that distillation process, most people would say, and this is a good beginning on the distillation process. Most people would say, if you read something like A Moveable Feast or the Nick Adams stories, and by the way, I'm just going to name off a whole bunch of Hemingway's writing today on the podcast. If you have an opportunity to go get any of these books, go get them. You know, they are brilliant. Green Hills of Africa. Farewell to Arms is a little bit more wobbly, but okay. And then the book that I thought he should have won a Nobel Prize for, The Sun Also Rises, which I thought was infinitely better than Old Man in the Sea, but we can leave that aside for just a moment. Just infinitely better. When you're talking about that distillation of truth, that doesn't make it, or no, the distillation of an idea, that doesn't make it any less truthful, right?
Correct.
Okay, so
it might make it clearer.
Clear, right?
Hence
and one
the
of the
metaphor of distilling, like
right.
one does with alcohol.
Correct. Okay, grain spirits, and so when leaders are searching for self-awareness, one of the things that I have noted in the course of the years that I've been doing this work and working with leaders, and I write about this in my book, 12 Rules for Leaders, the Foundation for Intentional Leadership, which you just heard an ad for at the beginning of this podcast. And you will hear me shilling for it on our shorts episodes this month and next month. So there you go. That was my pitch there. Just like I talk about in that book, we have to have clarity, right? We have to have clarity. We have to be able to have candor, and we have to be able to have courage as leaders. Can the memoir, and this is why we've been looking at memoirs this month, Joan Didion, Ernest Hemingway. Next week, we're going to look at Jack Kerouac. We're going to look at On the Road, who... I'm going to save my powder for that. And of course, we're going to close out the month with John Steinbeck and Travels with Charlie. By the way, a totally different writer, two titans of the 20th century who did not consider each other to be talented. And we'll talk about that a little bit later on, which is interesting. They both considered each other to be ripoffs, which is interesting. Not that they disrespected each other, but it was like two athletes, right, competing against each other. It was Larry Bird versus Michael Jordan, right, or Magic Johnson versus Michael Jordan. You're an athlete, I'm an athlete. Okay, congratulations, we're all athletes together. We're all distilling the truth together.
Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier. That's what comes to mind for me with those two guys. I'm like, all right, two heavyweights, go at it. In the wings is, I don't know whom to attach Faulkner to, but
right. Well,
I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that Mississippian.
Well, and Hemingway loved Faulkner. He thought Faulkner was a genius.
And Ellison.
Yeah. Baldwin. I mean, all those guys, right? 20th century was a century of literature, but it was also a century of getting that clarity, distilling that truth. Why do leaders struggle with doing that hard work of actually distilling that process, of going through that distillation process? Because many leaders that I run into look at reflection and journaling, look at any sort of self-reflective practice with short shrift.
Because all men are liars, except Jesus, because we fear what happens when we expose, truth through honest communication, right? Honesty meaning that reality exists and you have a choice about how you communicate it. So when we choose to communicate reality, we're telling the truth. And then we have to own up to our stuff because we all screw up. And perhaps the fear is if I expose who I really am and how I really behave to my team, the team will stop following.
Mm-hmm. Vulnerability, transparency. Yeah, I would agree with you if you're exposing yourself to the team. But what about exposing yourself to yourself?
Mm.
That's kind of the direction I'm thinking about today.
Hmm.
But we have to start off with this idea of discipline, right? Because exactly what Dorollo said is true. Hemingway wrote, standing up notoriously enough, but wrote repeatedly over and over and over again, trying to get to the truth of a sentence, trying to get to the truth of an idea. In the book that I just published, I would write a sentence, erase, delete it, and then write the sentence again, and then delete it and write the sentence again. And about after about 4 or 5 times, I would get to the truth of a statement, and that became a practice that influenced me. And the more I was able to write the truth of a statement about whatever leadership rule I was writing about, the closer I felt as though I was getting to saying the actual thing that needed to be said. Right.
Hmm.
That was getting to the truth of leadership. Well, that requires discipline, and Hemingway talks about that in his essay in A Moveable Feast. Hunger was good discipline. So we're going to go back to the book, and we're going to kind of look at this piece on discipline a little bit and explore some of these ideas with Dorollo here. From A Moveable Feast by Ernest Hemingway. Hunger was good discipline. We're going to read a couple of selections from this essay. You got very hungry when you did not eat enough in Paris, because all the bakery shops had such good things in the windows, and people ate outside at tables on the sidewalk so that you saw and smelled the food. When you were skipping meals at a time when you had given up journalism and were writing nothing that anyone in America would buy, explaining at home that you were lunching out with someone, the best place to do it was the Luxembourg Gardens, where you saw and smelled nothing to eat, all the way from the Place de l'Observatoire. I messed that up. To the Rue de Vaugirard. I messed that up too. By the way, he's in France. Dorollo speaks better French than I do.
Hmm.
I don't speak French at all, so anything that is a modicum better is better. I'm going to butcher all of the French words. I'm going to mangle all of them, because I'm a Spanish-speaking guy, or at least I was in high school. I did not study French. So forgive me. I know I'm pronouncing it wrong. All 3 of our listeners can send me emails, but please hold them. Okay. I know I'm doing it wrong. I would ask the
That's
Dorollo
funny.
beg my indulgence as well. There you could always go into the Luxembourg Museum, and all the paintings were heightened and clear and were beautiful if you were belly empty, hollow, hungry. I learned to understand Cézanne, that's a French word I know, much better, and to see truly how he made landscapes when I was hungry. I used to wonder if he were hungry too when he painted, but I thought it was possibly only that he had forgotten to eat. It was one of those unsound but illuminating thoughts you have when you have been sleepless or hungry. Later, I thought Cézanne was probably hungry in a different way. After you came out of the Luxembourg, you could walk down the narrow Rue Ferrou to the Place Saint-Sulpice, and there were still no restaurants, only the quiet square with its benches and trees. There was a fountain with lions, and pigeons walked on the pavement and perched on the statues of the bishops. There was the church, and there were shops selling religious objects and vestments on the north side of the square. From this square, you could not go further toward the river without passing shops selling fruits, vegetables, wines, or bakery and pastry shops. But by choosing your way carefully, you could work to your right around the gray and white stone church and reach the Rue de Léodon, and turn up to your right towards Sylvia Beach's bookshop. And on your way, you did not pass too many places where things to eat were sold. The Rue de Lyon was bare of eating places until you reached the square, where there were 3 restaurants. By the time you reached 12 Rue de Lyon, your hunger was contained, but all of your perceptions were heightened again. The photographs looked different, and you saw books that you had never seen before. Talking about the distillation of truth, we have a second book that we're also pulling from. This book, Ernest Hemingway on Writing, edited by Larry W. Phillips. I'm holding it up for those of you who are watching on the video. This is a selection of quotes, phrases, statements that that Ernest Hemingway wrote or said in his various works across time, throughout time. And it quotes directly from Hemingway on page 28 of this. He says, "Sometimes when I was starting a new story and I could not get it going, I would sit in front of the fire and squeeze the peel of the little oranges, there's food again, into the edge of the flame and watch the sputter of blue that they made. I would stand to look out over the roofs of Paris and think, do not worry, you have always written before and you will write now. All you have to do is write," to Dorollo's point, "one true sentence. Write the truest sentence that you know." So finally, I would write one true sentence and then go on from there. It was easy then because there was always one true sentence that I knew or had seen or had heard someone say. If I started to write elaborately or like someone introducing or presenting something, I found that I could cut that scroll work or ornament out and throw it away and start with the first true, simple, declarative sentence I had written. As Dorollo and I were just saying, this sounds simple in principle, and it sounds simple in practice, but this is really hard. And Dorollo and I have both written, Dorollo and I have both written books. Dorollo professionally is a lawyer, where there's a lot of gilding of the lily of language, very often among the legal class. I never read anything that Ernest Hemingway ever wrote about lawyers, but I don't think he probably held them in high esteem either. And this is not knocking lawyers. This is just, I think the thing he was pursuing was a thing that is the total opposite end of what the law pursues, and those are two tensions that exist in our society and culture, because sometimes you need more words to fully describe something, or to fully cover any potential contingency, right? Other times, and of course, you cannot cover all the potential contingencies because the world is infinite, and thus we have infinite language at that one end of the extreme. But then at the other end of the extreme, you've got Hemingway trying to distill one truth, one thing. How do leaders get to the truth through that discipline process? How do they get to the truth there, Dorollo? How do they... I know you already said, there's probably no way to do it. I prefer to think of it as as kind of a walking on a knife's edge. I think.
Well, no, I think it can be done. I think it can be done. It's just I know not to trust it when it's in writing, because I'm someone who my gut says recognition of the truth should have some spontaneity to it. Like lightning striking, and you have your eureka, your aha moment. And of course, there's also something to be said in a discipline and over time that the character of truth comes out as something forged in a fire, and thus a process of literally being ground down. You get to something that is a bedrock that is like truth. And so there are certain truths, or perhaps just certain, no. There are certain truths, I almost said, or perhaps just experiences, but it's like, no. They'll get to the same end, but they'll get to the same end because one is true of the other, no pun. But that you have to arrive at them through that process, that there's no way to get to it except through the fire. It has to be forged. It's not going to be, as Hemingway pointed out, oh, I heard somebody say a true sentence, so I wrote it down. As if he's an Apollonian priest.
Right.
Who heard, as it were, a God speak and said, oh, okay, I'll write it down. And thus spoke Zarathustra, thus wrote Ernest Hemingway. No, that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about something where a process of repetitive grinding down is shaving away things, is slowly removing that which obscures the truth.
The scroll work he was talking about throwing away.
Yes. And it's one of the hardest things with writing, as I'm sure you know. Annie Dillard has a book called The Writing Life. And in that book, in her first essay in that book, she talks about the need and the pain of cutting. But it's absolutely essential, that is an absolute essential aspect of writing, because if you don't, you may end up with a complete book that fails, right? because you left something in there that needed to be cut. So both she and Hemingway recognized that there was something, some sort of existential truth that not just existed in the universe, but existed in a work of art, existed in a piece of writing that you had to get to or the writing failed.
Okay, so there's a couple things I want to get your opinion on then on the podcast, because we've never actually talked about this. I don't even think we've talked about this personally, but we should talk about this here. You've got two different examples there that I'm taking a note here as I kind of lay out this thought. You've got two different thoughts here in writing, and this is where writing literature. This is why we're a literature podcast, because there's just so much stuff here, right? And in the great books of the Western canon, because of freedom of speech, as we talked about in our podcast episode number 16 with the Gulag Archipelago. Go listen to that. Leaders defend free speech. Free speech matters. Free speech matters. Free speech matters so that people can speak and write freely, regardless of whether they are distilling or prevaricating. Doesn't matter. They need to write, right? Because that is how we not only speak creation into the world. It's interesting you brought up the idea of an Apollonian. It's also how we get close to the core of a idea or of a perception or of an experience or of a circumstance or of even historical fact. Okay. Got two different kinds of writers inside of that. And like I said, we've never talked about this before. You got Isaac Asimov, who was not nearly precious about his work. He just wasn't. He went to the typewriter every day and Stephen Pressfield in his great book, The War of Art, which if you haven't read that, you should get it. But he talks about doing the work, right? Going to the typewriter every day between 8 a.m. and noon and typing for 4 hours. And it's good, it's good. It's bad, doesn't matter. Isaac Asimov is the most published author in the history of writing. Over 400 books, short stories, plays, manuscripts, television movie scripts. Isaac Asimov. Now, you can put him in the science fiction genre and dismiss him, as many people do, but he's still the most published author in the history of writing. Just is. Okay. Then you go on the other end of the spectrum and you've got a woman like Donna Tartt or Thomas Harris, who wrote the Hannibal novels, right? These people write one book every 20 years. The Goldfinch. I was working at a book company store retail that will remain nameless for the purposes of this podcast. Anyway, and I remember when Donna Tartt's Goldfinch came out, and everybody was lauding it. Goldfinch. This is the first book that she'd written in I think 15 years or something like that. And I think it's 800 pages. I read the first 3 pages of Goldfinch. I was done. I was out. I was like, I can't. I don't know what you're doing here. Now, that is my experience. Your mileage will vary for sure. It just absolutely will. And to all those people who love Donna Tartt, God bless you. She's fine. Or who like Thomas Harris and the Hannibal novels. I can read one novel about a guy eating people and I'm done. I'm out. But you see this more in fiction, I think. Stephen King, very prolific writer, right? What is the difference between being a writer and being a typist? Because I think Isaac Asimov would say he was a typist, but Ernest Hemingway would say he was a writer.
And Hemingway, do you think Hemingway would have said that Asimov was a typist and not a writer?
No, Hemingway died before Asimov really started getting some traction underneath him.
Well, he did talk about, I think he would have called him a typist. He did talk about it again in the Fitzgerald essay, right? Where
right.
He criticized F. Scott Fitzgerald, his great contemporary. And I don't think it matters if you think which of those two authors you think is better.
No.
It does matter to me if you don't think that one of them was good. But anyway.
Well, and it probably would have shocked Fitzgerald that everybody in high school now has to read The Great Gatsby. He'd probably be irritated by that, actually.
But I don't think Hemingway would have.
No, Hemingway would be like that.
He recognized that, this is really something. Like, this is great, which is what he said. And your response to Ms. Tart's work is like my response to The Great Gatsby. Zero anything, right over the shoulder, just out.
Well, okay. Do you like Ted?
You know, I mean, my dad grew up on Long Island. I know Long Island. We still have family there, right? Oh, just whoop, just like that.
Just right into the sound.
Yep. Whereas you give me something meaty by Olin Steinhauer, ding, done. Could sit there and read the thing. It actually holds my interest. He writes espionage fiction. It's a genre that I love. It's a genre that I write. And that's one thing. But okay, back to Fitzgerald. So what Hemingway was critical of Fitzgerald of in his essay was Fitzgerald marring or maligning or twisting what Hemingway viewed as the truth of his work so that it could sell. And Fitzgerald had no problem doing that because Fitzgerald knew, I'm a writer, I need to pay bills because I'm living as a writer. So I have to sell my work. And here is the genius is figuring out, here's the formula. And legal writing, just to go back to another point, basically is formulaic. And so as a creative writer, my frustration in law school was having to bend my thinking to this formula. The brilliance of the formula is once you have that formula, you can reproduce it ad nauseum and always arrive at something that is powerful. And so for someone like Fitzgerald, he could always produce a story that could be sold because he knew exactly what the formula was. And so for Fitzgerald, you know, sold his works and was able to feed his family. And Hemingway wrote an essay about being hungry, but wrote greater works because he refused to compromise what I'm going to call his artistic integrity. He refused to let his vision be clouded, even if it was going to make him money. And that's impressive.
Well, or even if he was going to starve walking down the street looking for a place to eat. He was willing. No, I think that's critical. Like that's actually a cut there. I think that's a critical statement you just said. Say that again. He was willing to.
He was unwilling to let his artistic vision be clouded, even if it meant it was going to make him money. What he wanted to do, I said it better the first time. What he wanted to do, oh, and just as an aside, what I meant about something coming ad hominem, that's what I mean, right? I have notes for what I wish to say. That's not in the notes. That just came through the creative process, you know? But talking about, you know, there's no way to avoid this. This is so funny. Because in the back of my head, I'm like, how do I bring up this point? Do I have to bring up this point? I think I have to bring up this point. How am I going to bring up this point? This used to be my favorite author until I found out how racist he was. And then I was just pissed. And this is high school. Wow. So I'm sitting there reading these works and I'm like, what the hell is that word? What? What? And unlike, say, you know, he's still writing. Cormac McCarthy, still alive, still writing.
Cormac McCarthy,
in his genre. And that pisses me off too. But there's something where, to me, it fits the context and the time. And I'm talking about if he's one of his works, which is set in the middle, not even in the middle, it's before the middle of the 19th century. I understand it there. It doesn't mean it doesn't piss me off. It just means I understand it. And there's an authenticity to it. So I can live with it. And, you know, I don't think the same about, say, Mark Twain for several reasons. One of which is Mr. McCarthy is still alive and still writing now. And Mark Twain was writing 130, 40 years ago. So, you know, but anyway.
Well, does the artist does the artist owe something to his time? Does and actually and by the way, that's too broad. That's too broad a question. Does the writer owe something to his time?
Well, the time that is the setting of the writing.
I'll frame it this way. I'm in the nonfiction business book space. Okay. Nonfiction business books are a genre where there's 400,000 books. You're going to be just one more book. It's fine. And the reason you're writing that book is because you want an idea to spread. That's the reason you write the book. It's actually not to get rich or get famous. Forget the Dan Pinks and the Malcolm Gladwells of the world that everybody knows. Forget that crap. Those people are operating at a different level. They're over there somewhere. It's comparing what's happening on Alpha Centauri to whatever's happening on Earth. I don't know what's happening on Alpha Centauri. I don't care. I have to live on Earth with all the other people, right? Okay. So In that space, there is a call for being tied to your time. And the best books, the books in nonfiction business that get to go to Alpha Centauri are the ones that aren't attached to any particular time. You can go into them at any point in time. And by the way, these are books like Think and Grow Rich, The Habits of Highly Effective People, Stephen Covey.
The 7 Habits of Stephen Covey. Yep, Covey.
Dale Carnegie, any of that stuff. Napoleon Hill, Dale Carnegie, Stephen Covey. Those are the big three. Those are the big three that are on Alpha Centauri somewhere in nonfiction business books. The writers in this space have a choice to make, an intentional choice to make. When you write a book on leadership in the middle of a COVID-19 pandemic, one of the first questions I got was, is this book going to be about the pandemic? And I said, no, because the pandemic is temporary. Leadership is infinite and permanent. And the look that I got was the look that you just gave me there on the video. You'll see
I was thinking about that. But, because you said something else was infinite, and I said, no, it isn't. That's what I said in my head, but I didn't say anything. So there I was thinking, wait, do I? And this time I actually agree. I do think that leadership is both infinite and permanent.
But COVID-19 is temporary. And so the tension is, do you write for the temporary? Are you authentic to the temporary moment and writing in reaction to that temporary moment? Or are you writing in reaction to something else that's non-temporal, that's again, more extended out, where the frame of engagement is bigger? Which frame of engagement are you picking? Now, fiction writers. Okay. I'm a fan. I'll use Stephen King as an example. I'm a fan of Stephen King books pre-car accident. I think what he wrote before the car accident has been infinitely better than whatever he wrote after the car accident. And the top of the pile of those books was actually the Gunslinger book. That was part of the Dark Tower series. Other people will say Tommy Knockers or Cujo or Carrie or something like that. Those were one-offs that were interesting, but not particularly relevant. I think the Gunslinger was the top of the mountain for a whole variety of different reasons. We can talk about that later if you're interested. It doesn't matter. Point is, that was written, he started writing that book in 1975 when he was like a 20-year-old. And he didn't finish writing it until he was in his 30s. And it's not a thick book. It's not a big book, but he does get to some eternal truths in there. And that's what makes it a top of the mountain book, unlike something like It, which makes for a good movie with a scary clown, but doesn't really go much further than that. Stephen King is not writing for the infinite. He's writing in relation to the now. So when you read It is definitely a book of the late 80s. It's calling back to the 50s. That's the point of it, but it's definitely a book for the late 80s. Tommy Knockers, the book that whenever you ask him about it in any interview, he'll say, I wrote that book high on cocaine. Like the whole time I was high on cocaine. Like I just was. And you can go into it, and there's some wild stuff in Tommy Knockers. You would have to be high out your mind to put that on paper. And because he had a book deal, it got published.
Yep.
So, I mean, there you go. That's the power of a book deal back in the 1980s before the internet. If he had that now, nobody would publish it. No one would touch it. It would be a blog somewhere that everybody would ignore, or a Kindle book, and it would go into memory hole and be done. And I'm not diminishing or denigrating the man's talent. I'm merely saying he was a product of his time and moment.
As are we all.
As a real. So Cormac McCarthy, can he be forgiven for not responding to his moment? Because the moment that he is writing in right now is a moment where if you're not loudly anti-racist and pro-social justice in every single tweet, posturing, even the way, I mean, we've watched Stephen King go off the rails in this. This is why I'm picking on him right now, because we've watched him go off the rails in this. I honestly don't think that Stephen King had a political thought in his head before Twitter. And now we're now exposed to all the political thoughts he has in his head, including the appropriately woke ones.
And Charles Schulz used to just sell coffee.
Yep. Yeah, or, do funky cartoons. Like, does a writer have a responsibility? And I like that dog. I like the dog in Peanuts. Like Snoopy. Does a writer have a responsibility to be authentic to their time, or do they have to go for something that's transcendent?
I mean, it's a choice. But here's how, if we stick to nonfiction, I
Yeah.
think we would judge and ought to, I think it's natural, we would judge that writer for ignoring his or her time and only writing about something that is profound. I think the challenge is using your time as a lens to both speak about what is going on and also speak about what is beyond that unites the human generations, you know? So for example, Abigail Adams wrote to her husband. She wrote about many things, but she wrote about her moment. And I think if she'd ignored her moment and only griped about domestic issues to John Adams, we would think very poorly of her, okay? At the same time, if she wrote only something, for lack of a better expression, highfalutin, okay? Something
I
for
am in
the
Texas.
ages
We
and
do like that term down
ignored,
here.
you know, didn't anchor it into the moment that she and her husband and their family were going through. I think we would have been critical of her, you know, for that, rather than her writing in her moment, talking about that revolution, what it meant, and talking about what women were doing and how men should be viewing it. And that's why I think, you know, why her writing is great and is great, you know. And so I think that there's always that choice, but for me, the challenge is how do you do both? So for example, with Stephen King and the two works you mentioned, or at least two of the works you mentioned, it and the other one of them seems like entertainment. So if it's brilliant entertainment, you're not looking for something eternal in it, so you would say. But when it's really done well, you can have both. You can have something that is entertaining and that reaches out towards eternity and lets you know these things, you know, that are going to matter. And I mean, the Greeks, many of them used to do that. And that's one of the reasons why reading their works still makes sense. Reading their works in translation 2,500 years later makes sense. And you can read them as entertainment. And of course, the ones that have either more relevant parts of truth that are raised and discussed and played out on a stage, or just more powerful perhaps, those ones will still read both as entertainment and insightfully, in terms of what it shows us about human nature, human character, the human experience. More important than that, God, the other parts of the universe and things that are going on. Now, you raised something earlier that I wanted to ask you about. So you said, about Asimov, you said, or do you relegate him into the department of science fiction, basically to say you don't matter, you're just writing nonsense. But why did that start? Because if you back up to 1960, that was a moment. And if you were writing science fiction, and of course I wasn't alive then, I was born at the end of the 70s, but it seemed to me that that was a moment where if you were writing science fiction, you were producing science fiction, if you were making television that was science fiction, films that were science fiction, that had humanity's collective, or at least the West's collective attention and imagination. And now the closest thing to that seem to be all of these mutant related films that literally I'm sick of. The ones that I liked the most were the Christopher Nolan, Mr. Nolan, Christian Bale, Christopher Nolan, and of course Gary Oldman, my favorite actor. The Batman,
No love for Heath Ledger
those
though.
Batman movies.
No love for the Joker.
Why? What?
No love for the Joker though. No love for Heath Ledger.
He was fine, but if he hadn't died, do you really think people would have been, you know, lauding that role? I don't know. I honestly don't know. I liked him in A Knight's Tale. I liked him in that dumb movie with Julia Stiles. You know,
yeah.
like, I'm sure there was power there, but frankly, in terms of Aussies or Kiwis moved to Australia, I prefer Russell Crowe. But you know, who knows? If you switch the two, and I don't obviously wish it on him, but if Crowe had died rather than Ledger, who knows? Maybe I would have the opposite view. Who knows? Maybe it's just literally lasting longer, produces my response in terms of Australians who have good truck in Hollywood. But you know, the reason I think those Batman ones resonate the way they do is because they aren't mutants. They're not superhuman things, right? who, for the record, you notice, aren't grounded in some kind of transcendent spiritual reality. So they're not angels or demons. They're not spirits who show up with the power that freaks out people when they show up, you know, justifiably. Well, mutants might, but the little twist that is done is because they're still humanoid and still produced by normal humans, unmuted humans, that whole spiritual realm, that whole realm, to borrow from the Greeks, that whole realm of the gods is just somehow just left wherever it is, dispensed with, still ignored.
Well, and
that's
this
what
is
they're doing. They're ignoring it. So,
well, and this is why
it's interesting.
this is why they built the Avengers, the Marvel Cinematic Universe. You know, the first level of the Marvel MCU Phase 1. And I know we're not a film podcast, but I'm going to respond to what Dorollo just said here because people need to know. This is why they built the MCU Phase 1 around Tony Stark. Because Tony Stark is to Marvel what Batman is to DC, what Bruce Wayne is to Batman. Tony Stark is to Iron Man now, which is interesting. The Iron Man in the Lego movie, the password to get into the Batcave is Iron Man sucks. So, you know, that's the password to get in. That was the little joke there.
That is brilliant.
The little twist there. Because Bruce Wayne in a bat suit and Tony Stark, who's basically Elon Musk, let's be real, in a mechanical Iron Man suit, are basically just normal guys who are showing up with big brains. That's literally all they're doing. Whereas, I was thinking about this the other day in a different kind of context. If you have tried to build a Marvel Cinematic Universe around Captain America, that's a little harder.
But it still works.
Yes,
I think it still works.
Yes, it still works.
He's not Magneto.
He's not Magneto.
Xavier,
correct. He's not any of those mutants. He's not any of those people coming in with these awesome powers or
anything.
anything.
An injection.
Right.
And here were the consequences of the injection.
Right.
And so now he can save America and the world.
Right.
And not die. And ta-da! Amazing. And I never thought about those parallels to right now. But anyway.
Oh, I did. I've been thinking about those for years. But those parallels are the reasons why he wasn't launched. Because at that time, Marvel, before the Disney acquisition, was moving in the direction of being a global brand. And these days, America doesn't have cultural confidence, which we also talked about in a couple podcasts ago. America is losing its cultural confidence because fundamentally it is losing understanding the baseline transcendent pillars of the West, including and most notoriously fleshed out in its great books, which is why we do the podcast that we do here. Okay. Another point that you made in there.
Fiction. What the heck happened?
Well, and let me go back to that idea that you had about Asimov in the 1960s. You're correct. The 1960s was the height of science fiction writing. You had Asimov working, you had Philip K. Dick producing, even though he wasn't getting nearly as much traction as he should have been, but you had Philip K. Dick producing. You had Blade Runner, the guy who wrote Blade Runner. Do androids dream of electric sheep? That's the root of Blade Runner, okay, that short story. Then a little bit later on, you had Harlan Ellison, who was writing science fiction, and then came along and started doing some more things in the 70s and the 80s when he got a little bit more traction, when Asimov kind of backed off a little bit. You also had, and I would be remiss if I did not mention this, because Dorollo went to Cornell University, and I worked at the college that was on the other hill, on the other side of Ithaca, because there are two colleges in Ithaca, not just one. And the person,
there's at least three, right? There's that TC3 too.
Well, and we don't talk about that one anyway.
We don't talk about Bruno.
And I happened to go to the museum display that is of this writer at this college, where he graduated with a degree in communications and public relations, and they named an entire media broadcasting wing after him, Rod Serling.
Oh, yeah.
Rod Serling was interesting because Rod Serling wrote for The Twilight Zone, some of the best science fiction writing of the mid-20th century, to Dorollo's point. He smoked, he drank, he wrote, he was a rabid anti-communist. He believed in the West, and his science fiction was well, for the time was considered to be progressive, but in looking back on it, it was really just old school capturing of the liberal values of the West and really laying those out in opposition to communism. But he also wrote, those of you who are paying attention to this, the original Planet of the Apes script with Charlton Heston and the brilliant twist ending, which if you have not seen that movie, I would recommend going back and watching it. It is a brilliant piece of art that will survive, just like Ernest Hemingway will, all the way into the 22nd and 23rd century, because it says something transcendent about human beings, even though it's wrapped up in time travel and apes and a guy getting in a rocket and all of those kinds of things, including the ending, which again, if you have not seen the original Planet of the Apes, I'm not talking about the Matt Reeves thing that they're doing now. The original Planet of the Apes, written by Rod Serling, great twist ending, and it still hits you in the gut. It still does. But he wrote all of that. That was him. That was the area. That was the era that Asimov was working in. He was working with giants. He was striding with giants in science fiction. And Dorollo is correct. That was an era where science fiction was considered to be a place of hope. I mean, you had the Jetsons on TV, for God's sakes. People believed after you went to the moon that the next thing was vacations on Mars.
Mm-hmm.
And we don't believe that anymore. Well, the last person to believe was a guy named Elon, but we'll leave him alone. We've not mentioned him twice. We'll leave him alone for the moment. I want to talk about this idea of compromise and artistic integrity and authenticity, but I want to roll into the guy we've been sort of dancing around for the last little bit. Hunger is discipline. But then, of course, there's a time when you run across a guy who's a genuine talent. And you may be a genuine talent yourself if you're a writer, but like has to meet like. And so we've mentioned him twice already. So we're going to talk a little bit about Scott Fitzgerald. Now, some of you may know him as F. Scott Fitzgerald, writer of such books as The Great Gatsby, which Dorollo threw over his shoulder into the Long Island Sound after getting 3 pages in. He may enjoy, however, I would recommend this one, Dorollo. You may enjoy Tender is the Night. That one you may enjoy.
I tried that one too.
Oh, never mind. That's 0 for 2.
I believe my mother liked it, but I was not getting through that.
So there you go. No love for Fitzgerald coming from that end. However, Fitzgerald was a genuine talent, and Ernest Hemingway recognized it and saw it, and he wrote about it in A Moveable Feast. So let us read a little bit from his essay on Scott Fitzgerald. His talent was as natural as the pattern that was made by the dust on a butterfly's wings. At one time, he understood it no more than a butterfly did, and he did not know when it was brushed or marred. Later, he became conscious of his damaged wings and of their construction, and he learned to think. He was flying again, and I was lucky to meet him just after a good time in his writing, if not a good one in his life. Now, this is an interesting essay because when he met F. Scott Fitzgerald, he focused on his physical nature, right? Hemingway did. Which, if you look at the front cover of the restored edition of A Moveable Feast, Hemingway wasn't a bad-looking guy. I mean, he would have fit right in with any of the folks that are walking around in 2022. Sometimes you look at pictures of writers and you can clearly see that they would have been anachronisms in whatever modern era it is that you're living in. I'm thinking of Oscar Wilde, right? Would have been an anachronism, would have stuck out like a sore thumb. Or even Mark Twain would have stuck out like a sore thumb. This is where Val Kilmer gets to go play Mark Twain in Branson, Missouri, and the only place he doesn't stick out is in Branson, Missouri. Everywhere else, though, probably not going to ride the lightning there. But Ernest Hemingway was able to do that. And so was Fitzgerald. And so he writes this. The first time I ever met Scott Fitzgerald, a very strange thing happened. Many strange things happened with Scott, but this one I was never able to forget. He had come into the Dingo Bar in the Rue de l'Ombre, where I was sitting with some completely worthless characters, had introduced himself and introduced a tall, pleasant man who was with him as Dunk Chaplin, the famous pitcher. I had not followed Princeton baseball and had never heard of Dunk Champlin, but he was extraordinarily nice, unworried, relaxed, and friendly, and I much preferred him to Scott. Scott was a man then who looked like a boy, with a face between handsome and pretty. He had very fair, wavy hair, a high forehead, excited eyes, and a delicate, long-lipped Irish mouth that, on a girl, would have been the mouth of a beauty. By the way, there have been statements made over the course of many years, off and on, intimating that perhaps Hemingway was a homosexual or might have had homosexual attraction to Scott Fitzgerald. It is beyond the pale of this podcast to comment on something like that, but I would be remiss if I did not bring up that point now, and you can go find it anywhere on the internet and go look at what other people have said about that. His chin was well built, and he had good ears and a handsome, almost beautiful, unmarked nose. This should not have added up to a pretty face, but that came from the coloring, the very fair hair in the mouth. The mouth worried you until you knew him, and then it worried you more. I was very curious to see him, and I've been working very hard all day, and it seemed quite wonderful that here should be Scott Fitzgerald and the great Dunk Champlin, whom I had never heard of, but was now my friend. Scott did not stop talking, and since I was embarrassed by what he said, it was all about my writing and how great it was, I kept on looking at him closely and noticed instead of listening. We still went under the system then that praise to the face was an open disgrace. Scott had ordered champagne, and he and Dunk Champlin and I drank it together with, I think, some of the worthless characters. I do not think that Dunk or I followed the speech very closely, for it was a speech, and I kept on observing Scott. He was lightly built and did not look in awfully good shape, as his face was faintly puffy. His Brooks Brothers clothes fitted him well, and he wore a white shirt with a button-down collar and a guard's tie. I thought I ought to tell him about the tie, maybe, because they did have British in Paris, and one might come into the Dingo. There were two there at the time. But then I thought, the hell with it, and I looked at him some more. It turned out later he had bought the tie in Rome. Then he describes the conversation, talks about some incidents occurring at the bar, and then says this: I gave up. And then he asked me, he meaning Fitzgerald, he asked me why I liked this cafe, and I told him about it in the old days, and he began to try to like it too, and we sat there, me liking it and him trying to like it, and he asked questions and told me about writers and publishers and agents and critics and George Horace Lorimer and the gossip and economics of being a successful writer, to Dorollo's point, and he was cynical and funny and very jolly and charming and endearing, and even if you were careful about anyone, becoming endearing. He spoke slightingly but without bitterness of everything he had written, and I knew his new book, the one that Dorollo threw over his shoulder, must be very good for him to speak without bitterness of the faults of past books. He wanted me to read the new book, The Great Gatsby, as soon as he could get his last and only copy back from someone he had loaned it to. To hear him talk of it, you would never know how very good it was, except that he had the shyness about it that all non-conceited writers have when they have done something very fine. And I hoped he would get the book quickly so that I might read it. Now I'm going to pause there for just a second because he's going to start talking about Zelda in just a minute. I want to talk about that. That's his first meeting with Scott Fitzgerald. This is his first meeting with the guy, right? His first meeting with the competition. And they're sort of taking each other's measure, right? They're sort of examining each other. Before we came on the podcast, we were talking about how, Hemingway and Steinbeck didn't really have much truck with each other. But Hemingway and Fitzgerald definitely, I think, respected each other. And, you can see this in a couple of statements that he writes in his book, or in the selections that have been pulled from his writings and his statements. Ernest Hemingway on Writing, edited by Larry W. Phillips. He talks about, what are the books? He was interviewed in a place called Byline, right? And Hemingway was asked by the interviewer, a person named Mice, what books should a writer read? And this goes directly to Fitzgerald. What books should a writer read? And he says he should read everything so he knows what he has to beat. He can't have read everything. I don't say that he can. I say what he should. Of course he can't. Well, what books are necessary? He should have read War and Peace and Anna Karenina by Tolstoy, Midshipman Easy, Frank Mildmay, and Peter Simple by Captain Marryat, Madame Bovary and L'Education Sentimentale by Flaubert, Buddenbrooks by Thomas Mann, Joyce's Dubliners, Portrait of the Artist, and Ulysses, which, by the way, pause, I'm not smart enough to finish Ulysses. It'll be on the podcast eventually. Tom Jones and Joseph Andrew by Fielding, Le Rouge et Le Noir and La Chartreuse de Parme by Stendhal, The Brothers Karamazov, and any other two Dostoevskys. We finished Crime and Punishment earlier. Go back and listen to that episode. Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain, The Open Boat and The Blue Hotel by Stephen Crane, Hail and Farewell by George Moore, Yeats's autobiographies, and all the good de Maupassant, which we've read before, all the good Kipling, all of Turgenev, Far Away and Long Ago by W.H. Hudson, Henry James's short stories, especially Madame de Mauves, and The Turn of the Screw, The Portrait of a Lady, The American. I can't write them down that fast. How many more are there? I'll give you the rest another day. There are about 3 times that many. Should a writer have read all of those? All of those and plenty more. Otherwise, he doesn't know what he has to beat. What do you mean he has to beat? Listen. There is no use writing anything that has been written before unless you can beat it. What a writer in our time has to do is write what hasn't been written before or beat dead men at what they have done. The only way he can tell how he is going to compete with dead men. But reading all those good writers might discourage you. I love this. Then you ought to be discouraged.
Great use of should and ought.
You said he didn't compromise with artistic integrity.
That's part of his greatness.
I think of the line in Braveheart, and I wanted to bring this up on the podcast for a while, when the guy who's supposed to be the leader, or the son of the leader, is supposed to follow Mel Gibson, and he goes and asks his father, who's leprous, should I follow this man? And the man says, you're the 13th Robert the Bruce, because a whole bunch of people passed you land and title. I'm paraphrasing now, but a whole bunch of people passed you land and title because they did not run in, they did not fight. Well, I love this man, or not love this man. He says, I want to go with this man. He's great. He says things and he means them. And this father takes all of his leprous energy, rises up off the bed and says, you would follow this man because he doesn't compromise. It is easy to admire the uncompromising, but it is compromise that makes us men. You're a political guy. You've been in politics. That is an extremely political statement said with conviction. And then, of course, at the end of the movie, the 13th Robert the Bruce goes off and tells his father, I don't want anything from you. I want you to die. He closes the door. It's a great scene. And who knew Mel Gibson?
Dies.
And the man dies. Yeah. Who knew Mel Gibson had that in him, by the way? Nobody knew that. I mean, the guy from Lethal Weapon, who knew that? Who knew he had that in him? At the time, anyway. Hemingway didn't compromise. You get the sense from Fitzgerald that he didn't compromise either. Leadership, the straw, or the saw, I should say, the saw is a better term. The saw is that leadership is nothing but compromise.
I don't think that's true.
Well, you hear that a lot, though, right? Or at least I hear it a lot in the field in which I'm in. How could leaders use writing, use the memoir style to reflect so that they can make a decision about whether or not to compromise, and sub-question, what to compromise on, looking at how Hemingway and Fitzgerald have both approached this?
It's tough because compromise is how we live together without killing each other, without destroying each other. JFK said, quote, it is compromise that prevents each set of reformers from crushing the group at the other end of the political spectrum, close quote. So, period. So if we look at what we're going through in the last couple of weeks, what we're not going to see and what we don't hear evoked is compromise.
But he also said,
Um,
leaders let every nation know we will bear any burden and pay any price
mhm,
to ensure the survival and the success of liberty.
mhm.
That's not a compromising statement. We will oppose
Correct.
any foe, support any friend. Da, 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 da. He was talking directly to the communists.
Right. It was an amazing inaugural, and it obviously was not the preamble to any piece of legislation. you know, and in practice, of course, JFK was somebody. So, I mean, obviously, I didn't know him from reading his writings and reading about him and reading especially about his life. Um, he could be a very hard realist, right? But obviously a man of courage. He knew how to push the envelope, but he could also be a realist. And so, for example, when the Bay of Pigs invasion failed, well, that was the end of that. Go back to the drawing board. He did not say, as somebody recently evoked in the context of Roe v. Wade, this is the hill that we die upon. Well, the Bay of Pigs invasion was not the hill that JFK died upon, thankfully. And so, he had sound judgment. He could say, all right, this is what we tried. Here was our hope. Here are our ideals. This is wonderful. This didn't work. Okay, back to the drawing board, and at the same time, and if I'm not mistaken, during the same year, he could call Khrushchev's bluff and not back down and force, the Red Bear, as it were, to turn around, to turn tail. So he knew how to push the envelope, and I find that quite impressive. So for the artist, though, the artistic vision shouldn't be compromised, but that always comes with a cost. One of the costs we see in great authors is their marriages, right?
Oh,
They're atrocious, right? And he
yes.
wrote about, in two of the essays that we read in preparation, the one here is Hawks Do Not Share, right? The impact, the negative impact that Fitzgerald's wife Zelda had on his, artistic production. And of course, I haven't read biographical information about the Fitzgeralds, either of them, outside what Hemingway wrote about them. And so I know to distrust some of what he's writing. Some of it, at a minimum, there should be some skepticism, And even if you were to produce to me a journal or a diary entry where Zelda Fitzgerald said, here's what I'm trying to do to stop my husband from writing because he's got to focus on me first. Okay, sure, whatever. So I think, I take it with a grain of salt, right?
Well, and I put this in our notes for today as well. I mean, to piggyback off of that, because we're kind of bouncing around all over my notes now, but it's good because we're talking about important stuff here. But the only two people who know what is going on in a marriage are the two people in the marriage.
Well, and
they're
God,
the only two.
3 people. But yeah.
Yes, okay, 3. Yes, God is also the third entity that knows what is actually going on.
Dorollo is not avoiding the transcendent, which is populated by beings. So
correct. And I'm not avoiding the transcendent either. I am attempting to get to the truth of something here. And the truth of the thing is, if you are a third person on the outside, how can you know? You can't, right? You can't know unless you are an incredibly incisive observer of human nature with zero judgment and flaws of your own, in which case you'd be a transcendent being called God. And you wouldn't need to observe that because you'd be too busy doing other things. Or you would be delusional. And we're going to talk about Hawks Do Not Share in just a minute, because that's an essay I've been wanting to talk about for years with somebody. There's so many things inside of that essay, so many ideas inside of that essay. But let's talk about Hemingway and his atrocious marriages. Hemingway had 4 marriages, if I'm not mistaken. Right? He had 4, if I remember correctly.
I'll confirm if it is.
Fact checkers will go back and look at me. Or we'll go back and look. I believe it was 4 marriages, or either that or it was 3 and a mistress. I can't remember. Point is,
4 wives.
4 wives.
Hadley, Pauline, Martha Gellhorn, and Mary Welsh.
And Mary Welsh. There you go. Okay. He was also around at a time, and I mentioned this again in my notes. Gertrude Stein was well, in the common parlance of our time, an out lesbian.
Mhm.
Everyone knew who and what she was in Paris, and no one was gigantically shocked. As a matter of fact, there's an essay, a wonderful essay in the collection about the nature of the nature of Stein's relationship with another woman. And Hemingway kind of observed that from the outside, and it kind of put him off from her, and their relationship gradually went into the toilet. Then you also have Pablo Picasso, who well, I think I've said this before on the podcast, but it bears repeating. If there's any visual artist I could go back in time in the 20th century and maybe get into a fist fight with, it'd be Pablo Picasso. I think that guy did more to damage art and damage visual artistic production than any other artist of the 20th
Oh,
century.
wow. I so disagree.
That's fine. That's fine. This is not a visual art podcast either. So
No plastic here.
we're gonna
All
we're gonna leave it.
environmental friendly. All
All
words, they biodegrade. You
That's
don't
right.
have to worry about it.
That's right. That's right. And because I'm a root cause guy, it's mostly Picasso's followers, but he would have had followers if he hadn't existed. So we got to go back to the root. We got to dig out that root. Anyway, but Picasso had multiple wives, multiple mistresses. He was terrible to women too.
Mhm.
Why are these talented people? And we see this even in our own time. We talked about Chris Rock. We won't talk about the other gentleman that was on the other side of the particular incident that I'm now referencing on purpose. His marriage is about to be exposed as potentially being atrocious. We are in the midst of, since we're going to make this a temporal podcast for this moment, we're in the midst of the Amber Heard Johnny Depp trial, where atrociousness is being revealed in all kinds of different ways from these public figures. But these are highly talented individuals. Why can't highly talented individuals have decent relationships? Or is it, or sub question, is it because the pool of highly talented individuals is so small that when they screw up, the screw ups in their personal relationships are just magnified because the pool is so tiny?
So my approach to answering the question draws upon I don't know, I guess it's more practical, right?
Mhm.
When you take a flawed human being who is mortal and you give him, because in this case, the flawed human being is male, you give him something of transcendent power, like beauty, like money, like the ability to produce something that awes his fellows. People react to you in a way where the things in life that normally are struggle to obtain are handed to you, sometimes for free. And there are a variety of categories, but this seems to happen to the talented, to the genie, meaning the geniuses, plural, right? The genie, or the genii, however it's pronounced in Latin. Because that man's nature is both flawed and corrupt, it has a corrupting influence on that person. And so to the extent that power corrupts, as Lord Acton said, power corrupts and absolute power, absolutely. Okay, genius corrupts and absolute genius, absolutely. Why? It's because man is corrupt. And so when you then give and turn over to man who is corrupt these things, of course he smashes them like the china in a shop because he's basically a toddler. And I'm not coming at calling him a toddler as a feminist might, calling a man a toddler, meaning he just needs to grow up. I mean, there's something about the nature of a toddler, meaning I like, so I do this. There isn't that sense of the consequences. There also isn't necessarily, and certainly not fully developed, a sense of compassion. You talk about self-awareness and leadership. There's a mirror relationship between self-awareness and compassion. Self-awareness should produce compassion in the leader for the followers, because the leader himself knows about his failings. The leader herself knows about her failings, and can put, hopefully, her or himself into the situation that the followers are in and understand the pressure they're under. I remember one of my old bosses lecturing us, and it was not exactly a fireside chat. It's more, he comes in and sits on a box of documents that we have to read through that we don't want. It's that kind of chat. Okay. And it's whatever time, 8 at night, 9 at night. We don't want to be at work. We don't want to be reading all of this stuff. Okay. All of these documents. We had to as part of litigation. And basically he sat there and he shared stories from back in the 90s when whole floors in Rock Center for our old firm, his firm, my old firm, were devoted to just warehousing documents that everyone was reviewing because they just had to be reviewed. And he was telling us about an experience that was tremendously more grinding and burdensome than what we were going through. But he was telling us, I can relate to where you are. I can empathize to what you're going through because I've been there. Okay. But we still had to do the work. And that's hard-headed compassion, as I believe you said. And
oh yeah,
there it is. Hard-headed empathy.
Hard-headed empathy.
So to steal from your notes, hard-headed.
Yeah,
empathy.
No.
I think that self-awareness can produce that, right? But it just can't compromise the vision. Or in the context I was just in, there's the objective the team needs to accomplish, and you cannot compromise that. It has to get done, or you're not being an effective leader. It's how you get it done that makes all of the difference. And so a lack of compassion in geniuses is a lack of self-awareness, but I think that their judgment is clouded by all of the adulation that is given to them. You know, normally man struggles for making a living, let alone success. It's a struggle, and you should value the success you achieve because of the struggle. When it's just handed to you, like anything that's handed to a toddler, it's not going to be valued. So, you know, perhaps that's why they tend to, especially the men, tend to struggle in their marriages. And not only the men. I mean, I think Norma Jean, and again, as you said, I can't, I'm not in her marriage, never was, right? Norma Jean, a la Marilyn Monroe, multiple marriages. Okay. Do I think she was a genius? Yes. I think she had something and knew she had something and knew how to use it. And it was profoundly electric. And yet, how do you then get through normal life?
Right? I think Elizabeth Taylor was probably a better example there.
Yeah.
Because she had multiple marriages. She couldn't hold it down. But she apparently an incredibly compassionate person. Was a really good friend of Michael Jackson back in the day. Engaged with patients around, well, not patients, but engaged with victims of AIDS and of HIV in a time when people were not even interested remotely in even being around those folks. Back when plagues were much more localized, let's just say. Yes. And so, but yeah, no, women have it too. I think it manifests differently in different kinds of ways, because women are much more grounded in relationship than men are, for a whole variety of reasons. The most notorious being that's how we're wired. That's how we were made, because we serve different purposes. But I think I think you're getting something fundamental there. And in getting to that, I'd like to take that turn and go into Zelda and into talking about Zelda. Back to A Moveable Feast. He told me that he and Zelda, his wife, had been compelled to abandon their small Renault motor car in Lyon because of bad weather, and he asked me if I would go down to Lyon with him on the train to pick up the car and drive up with him to Paris. The Fitzgeralds had rented a furnished flat at 14 Rue de Tilsit, not far from the Etoile. It was late spring now, and I thought the country would be at its best and we could have an excellent trip. So he goes and he picks up the car, and he closes out the essay on Fitzgerald by saying this: "It is strange now to remember thinking of Scott as an older writer, but at the time, since I had not yet read The Great Gatsby, I thought of him as a much older writer who had written a very silly, badly written, and collegiate book, followed by another book I had been unable to read." I think that's analysis that Dorollo would agree with. I thought he wrote Saturday Evening Post stories that had been readable 3 years before, but I never thought of him as a serious writer. He told me at the Closerie de Liels how he wrote what he thought were good stories and which really were good stories for the Post, and then changed them for submission, knowing exactly how he must make the twists that made them into saleable magazine stories. This is that idea, by the way, pause. This is that idea, by the way, that Dorollo was just talking about taking a book, taking a talent, not even a book, taking a talent and putting it inside of a formula in order to repeat the formula to pay your bills. This is what Fitzgerald is doing. This is what Hemingway is describing Fitzgerald is doing. And he's not doing it with a sense, he's not describing this with a sense of amazement or awe. He is indeed describing this from a sense of, you've betrayed your talent. I had been shocked, back to A Moveable Feast, I had been shocked at this and said I thought it was whoring. He said it was whoring, but he had to do it as he made his money from the magazines to have money ahead to write decent books. I said I did not believe anyone could write anyway except the very best they could write without destroying their talent. He said he had to learn to write the stories for the Post so that they did him no harm at all. He wrote the real story first, he said, and then the destruction and the changing did him no harm. I could not believe this, and I wanted to argue him out of it, but I needed a novel to back up my faith and to show him and convince him, and I had not yet written any such novel. Since I had started to break all my writing down and get rid of all facility and try to make instead of describe, writing had been wonderful to do, but it was very difficult, and I did not know how I would ever write anything as long as a novel. It often took me a full morning of work to write a paragraph. Then we're going to move ahead a little bit, talk directly about Scott Fitzgerald's marriage from A Moveable Feast, the essay titled Hawks Do Not Share. Scott Fitzgerald invited us to have lunch with his wife Zelda and his little daughter at the furnished flat they had rented at 14 Rue de Tilsit. I cannot remember much about the flat except that it was gloomy and airless, and there was nothing in it that seemed to belong to them except Scott's first books bound in light blue leather with titles in gold. Scott also showed us a large ledger with all the stories he had published listed in it year after year, with the prices he had received for them and also the amounts received for any motion picture sales and the sales and royalties of his books. They were all noted carefully as the log of a ship, and Scott showed them to both of us with impersonal pride as though he were a curator of a museum. Scott was nervous and hospitable, and he showed us his accounts of his earnings as though they had been the view. There was no view. Now, this story is related after a night of partying where Zelda had a hangover. Zelda had hawk's eyes and a thin mouth and deep South manners and accent. Watching her face, you could see her mind leave the table, because they were sitting at the breakfast table, leave the table and go to the night's party and return with her eyes blank as a cat's, and then pleased, and the pleasure would show along the thin line of her lips, and then be gone. Scott was being the good cheerful host, and Zelda looked at him, and she smiled happily with her eyes and her mouth too as he drank the wine. I learned to know that smile very well. It meant she knew Scott would not be able to write. Zelda was very jealous of Scott's work, and as we got to know them, this fell into a regular pattern. Scott would resolve not to go on all-night drinking parties and to get some exercise each day and work regularly. He would resolve to engage in some form of discipline. He would start to work, and as soon as he was working well, Zelda would begin complaining about how bored she was and get him off on another drunken party. They would quarrel and then make up, and he would sweat out the alcohol on long walks with me and make up his mind that this time he would really work and would start off well. Then it would start all over again. Scott was very much in love with Zelda, and he was very jealous of her. Then Hemingway proceeds to describe how they handled their alcohol, which you can read yourself. Scott told me about the Riviera and how my wife and I must come up there the next summer and how we would go there and how he would find a place for us that was not expensive and we would both work hard every day and swim and lie on the beach and be brown and only have a single aperitif before lunch and one before dinner. Zelda would be happy there, he said. She loved to swim and was a beautiful diver, and she was happy with that life and would want him to work and everything would be beautiful. He and Zelda and their daughter were going to go there that summer. I was trying to get him to write his stories as well as he could and not trick them to conform to any formula, as he had explained that he did. You've written a fine novel now, I told him, and you mustn't write slop. The novel isn't selling, he said. I must write stories, and they have to be stories that will sell. Write the best story that you can and write it as straight as you can. I'm going to, he said. But the way things were going, he was lucky to get any work done at all. And then the close of Hawks Do Not Share. While we were living in the Vorarlberg and I was finishing rewriting the novel, Scott and his wife and the child had left Paris for a watering place in the Lower Pyrenees. Zelda had been ill with that familiar intestinal complaint that too much champagne produces and which was then diagnosed as colitis. Scott was not drinking and started to work, and he wanted us, really, to come to the Juan Les Pins in June. They would find an inexpensive villa for us, and this time he would not drink, and it would be like the good old days, and we would swim and be healthy and brown and have one aperitif before lunch and one before dinner. Zelda was well again, and they were both fine, and his novel was going wonderfully. He had money coming in from a dramatization of The Great Gatsby, which was running well, and it would sell to the movies, and he had no worries. Zelda was really fine, and everything was going to be wonderful. He talks about being down in Madrid, and he mentions a party at the end here. The McLeishes, the Murphys, the Fitzgeralds. No one drank anything stronger than champagne, and it was very gay, meaning happy, back in the day, and obviously a splendid place to write. And the close of Hawks Do Not Share. Zelda was very beautiful and was tanned a lovely gold color, and her hair was a beautiful dark gold, and she was very friendly. Her hawk's eyes were clear and calm. I knew everything was all right and was going to turn out well in the end when she leaned forward and said to me, telling me her great secret, "Ernest, don't you think Al Jolson is greater than Jesus?" Nobody except Pauline thought anything of it at the time. It was only Zelda's secret that she shared with me, as a hawk might share something with a man. But hawks do not share. Scott did not write anything anymore that was good until after he knew she was insane. Zelda Fitzgerald did wind up in a sanitarium. She did, in the common parlance of today, go a little crazy.
Yep, and 200 years ago, she'd have been in somebody's attic. So,
Yep.
you know.
There have been books written about Zelda Fitzgerald. Most recently, a book published, I think, probably about 4 or 5 years ago, which oddly enough my wife read, or interestingly enough, depending upon your perspective, written from Zelda's perspective about all of this, because, of course, we live in a post-feminist world where equality and equity on all subjects rule the day, and everyone's perspective, even the perspective of those who may not have written down one, can be made up and be latched onto something as a facet of a reality
And then
that
become
never,
the only thing that's valid. Yeah.
well, of a reality that never existed was where I was really going to go with that. But okay. The first time I read that essay, I was maybe 17, 18 years old. And I didn't really understand it. Because A, I hadn't been married. What did I know? And B, I didn't know anything about male-female relationships. I knew less than nothing, and I still know less than nothing. I think there are people in my life who would say that right now. It's a constant learning process. And, this is being written from the perspective of Hemingway, right? And he clearly told this to his wife, Pauline, who I believe was either the second or the third wife that he had in hanging out with the Fitzgeralds. And from his book on Ernest Hemingway on writing, from the book Ernest Hemingway on writing, I would mention this quote: For your information. He's been asked about stories on war, and I want to make a parallel here to marriage and to what he's saying about Zelda. For your information and stories about the war, I try to show all the different sides of it, taking it slowly and honestly and examining it from many ways. So never think one story represents my viewpoint, because it is much too complicated for that. We know war is bad, yet sometimes it is necessary to fight, but still war is bad, and any man who says it is not is a liar. But it is very complicated and difficult to write about truly. For instance, to take it on simply and personal basis, in the war in Italy when I was a boy, I had much fear. In Spain, I had no fear after a couple of weeks and was very happy. Yet for me to not understand fear in others or deny its existence would be bad writing. It is just that now I understand the whole thing better. I would not be able to write understandingly about both deserters and heroes, cowards and brave men, traitors and men who are not capable of being traitors. We learned a lot about such people. I would replace his word war with marriage in there and leave the comments exactly the same.
Mm-hmm.
The two books that are mostly noted for Hemingway kind of having a struggle with the female presence are Farewell to Arms and the injury that impedes male performance in The Sun Also Rises, because Jake can't perform and the woman goes away.
Mm-hmm.
The question here is, as a leader, what do we do with this? This is a pile of ideas here, right? And so how do we get to the understanding of the truth of relationships if you're a leader? And I go to the idea that I want to end the podcast with, and we're going to wrap up talking here in a little bit about a guy named Stephen Elop, who was the CEO of Nokia during a time when Nokia was going to crap in the early 2000s, who wrote an infamous memo called the Burning Platform Memo. And if you look at Stephen Elop's personal life, though, it's not great. To Dorollo's point about people being given things that are hard to work for, they're just handed them, those kinds of things when they exhibit some modicum of talent. Leaders who have a modicum of talent, what's the warning for them? I guess that's my question. What's the warning for them? What's the warning for them when they run into the Zeldas of the world? What's the warning for them when they run into the Hemingways of the world? What's the warning for them, Dorollo?
The talent is precious and that it matters, and you're going to be held accountable for how you used it. But if you don't learn how to structure your work so that your life dash relationships dash marriage dash don't interfere with it, you're not going to be able to realize either anything, or there will be things missing. There will be works you could not do, and it will be your fault for not making the right judgment and then taking the steps so that you can actually accomplish your work. Yeah, that's what I would say.
Judgment's key, right? But we're in an era now where we're in a weird moment in the West where, and I kind of visited this on a previous podcast, but I want to visit it with you here now. We're in a weird moment in the West, right? Where we've gone from, I can individually create my own values and you can't judge me for that. My truth is not your truth. It's just relativistic. That's the legacy you mentioned. Thus spake Zarathustra. That is the dangerous legacy of that wily German down in the basement who I keep promising we'll get to on the podcast, and we will. He's on our schedule. We're going to go down to the basement and wrestle with Nietzsche. Because someone, just like Pablo Picasso, someone needs to hold him responsible for the death of the West. Someone needs to put Nietzsche on trial and find him guilty. And I'll be that person. It's my podcast. I can do that.
Yes, you can.
But we've now gone from you can't judge me as an individual to you can't judge me as a individual within society. And that's a subtle shift. I think of, regardless of what you think of the less than 1% of the population that suffers from gender dysphoria, regardless of what you think their rights should be in a legal context, in a socially negotiated cultural context, we are going to have a judgment about your switching of gender. We just are. We're going to have a judgment on that. And it may not be a judgment you like, but we're negotiating. One of the rules in my book is that leaders don't confuse liking with agreement. And I think too many people confuse liking with agreement. Too many leaders do this. And in a time where we've arrived in the clearing at the end of the path of relativism, how do we make those judgments so that we can set up those boundaries and borders? Now, you and I know how. I mean, we believe in a transcendent being. We believe that conforming to the rules of that transcendent being has set down for us because they come about over thousands of years, and they have been proven to be correct because human nature is flawed and we are fallen. As you mentioned before, we live in a fallen world. So we conform to those boundaries. But for all of the people who have made it this far, who are listening, who do not conform to those boundaries, how do they make judgments so that they can set up those boundaries that you were talking about so that their talent can be funneled in the right direction?
Well, I mean, initially, I would say they're making those judgments anyway. It's just, we breathe in, we breathe out, we make judgments.
Right.
If you don't make judgments, don't cross the street. Because if a car is coming and you don't judge the danger, you have some likelihood of dying quickly. Where that arguably could have been avoided just by using judgment, using an understanding of physics and the dynamics of how cars move, let's say in the United States of America in an urban setting.
Right.
And just an understanding of what can happen if you step into the road without paying attention. You can get crushed to death by a truck. So here's another little offshoot analogy. How do we react when we see a toddler by herself toddling towards the road? We panic. Why? Because our judgment about the danger posed in the next few moments is acute, gets a hold of our emotions, and we react. We do this all the time. We make judgments all the time. I think the challenge is, and as you said, the challenge is how do you interact socially without violence with people with whom you do not share an agreement on the validity of certain behaviors, the goodness or badness of certain behaviors, social behavior, you know. And I think that's, you know, what the challenge is. And so one of the aspects that, in my opinion, allows for leadership to focus on leadership's job is recognizing the things that are within the realm of addressing by a leader and the things that aren't. Now, I'm a conservative politically. What it means at a minimum is this. I recognize a distinction between the state and society, between individuals and their families and natural organic social formations, and an entity called the state that has legitimate authority to tell us certain things, but whose authority has a limit and also has an observable boundary. And so that's what I mean by conservatism. At a minimum, it's that. Bringing that into the social context. bringing that into the leadership context or the leadership aspect of the social context, I think one of the things leaders have to do is decide what they're not going to have an opinion on. And it doesn't mean that they agree or are affirming the behavior. It basically means this is not my business. My job is to get this team to do A, B, C. My job is not to get this team to do D, E, F, Q, Z, F, X, whatever. My job is to get this team to do A, B, C. Now, I actually believe that if that team is doing D, E, F, it may impact their ability to do A, B, C. I recognize that. I'm not someone who denies that axiom, or what used to be an axiom, right? It was the notion that, well, if a man couldn't be faithful to his wife, you couldn't trust him to honor a contract. There is something to that axiom, but I don't think it's the be all and end all. I think there will be very many men and women who will execute on their contractual obligations without an issue, who you would not want to be in a social relationship with because they're not going to honor the principles or the canons that go with that relationship.
Okay, so now you've gotten to something there. I want to pause you for just a second. You've gotten to something there that is at the crux of the problem in Western civilization right now. Mm-hmm. The crux of the problem in Western civilization is we have taken the Betty Friedan feminist line of the personal is political, and the political is what is more real than the moral or the ethical or the boundary. And we have said that, on the one hand, we cannot judge you if you are the president of the United States and you are engaging with shenanigans with a cigar with an intern, which is really where a lot of this started at the social level. We cannot make a judgment about that because it doesn't impact you running the country. By the way, we've now gone from that to we can have no opinion, or we can not only have no opinion, we will abdicate on judging the behavior of your family that might lead to direct corruption in a political context with our enemies. Mm-hmm. There is a straight line from Bill Clinton's cigar and Monica Lewinsky to Hunter Biden's laptop. Mm-hmm. 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 Okay. That kind of line erodes the social fabric. And I would assert that people in authority used to know what you know, but I believe that they've pulled out the guardrails, to paraphrase from the theologian Doug Wilson. They've pulled out the guardrails, they've piled them in a field, they've set them on fire, and they've run down the road. Mm-hmm. And we're now living in a guardrail-less world where our leaders are running down the road saying, follow me. There are no guardrails, and even if there were, it doesn't matter. And we seek guardrails because you're right, we make judgments. Mm-hmm. And it is innocuous leaders that where it is now upon them. It is the hobbits because the kings and princes have abandoned the field. Mm-hmm. The kings and princes in celebrity, the kings and princes on social media, the kings and princes in politics, they have abandoned the field. And it's up to Frodo and Bilbo to save everybody. Mm-hmm. Because who else is going to put the boundaries up? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And that is a massive challenge for people who just believe they're running a construction company from 9 to 5.
Yes, it can be. It can be. It's, again, actually there was a point I was going to raise. Oh, that's praise the Lord. It's about the science fiction. Okay. Mm-hmm. Why I think science fiction got consigned to the dustbin of Western culture for the moment, because I don't really think it's going to go away. But the reason it's there right now is because I think in the 80s, okay, and certainly afterward, but in the 80s, a fatal materialism took hold of, at a minimum, American culture. And even took hold of Hollywood, if you will, which of course is part of American culture. And so now we cannot have people thinking about the stars and something greater that is more powerful, that is also doing its own thing, following its own dictates, having nothing to do with Earth. We can't think about life that way anymore. We have to think about life as if aliens, if they show up, are always going to show up to destroy the Earth. They're not going to show up and do something ameliorative. So First Contact from Star Trek, that's not going to happen. They're going to come and destroy us. They're not going to come and help. That notion is gone, okay, for several reasons. One of them is that it would imply that there's something greater than humanity who could actually teach us something. And we need to have the humility to recognize, see that ship coming down and landing and hear people walking out? Okay, they might be greater. You might be on notice that that is respond. And of course, my wife and I were just seeing X-Men Days of Future Past. And so there's a moment where another President Nixon, actually being impersonated by Raven, the mutant, is basically challenging Magneto in a way where that's the human response. What do? You show up, you got more power, we're going to destroy you. Either we can use you the way we want and control you, or we'll destroy you. That's it. There's no other way of thinking. Welcome to human nature, human nature 1. So with science fiction going out of the window, I think it's because of the fundamentally, some of it is boredom, but I think there's a fundamental fatal materialism, and not just the money. Yes, the money, but not just the money. Back to the construction, the man or woman running a construction company, okay? If they've been affected with this fatal materialism, that's how they see their raison d'etre. This is why they're here. This is why they exist, to run this company. How do I run this company? I get the most projects and I make the most money. Not I get the best projects, which may only be one in your entire career, and I do those better than anyone else ever could. That's a different ethic. That's an ethic that says what I'm doing has some kind of transcendent value in such a way that I will choose to do this project, choose not to do other projects, because this project matters more, even if it doesn't make me as much money. That notion is not there, I would argue, often. Okay, I think they're more focused on, and again, I'm making a judgment. I think they're more focused on, how do I get more projects? How do I do more to make more money? I'm going to value my success based on the amount of dollars that it brings to my company, rather than I'm going to value my success because it does something that you can't put a dollar value on, or advances other values. Okay. So I know a man in Binghamton, and he owns a construction company, and he built a VA facility. And I remember the praise he received for building the facility. Facility looked fine. I've been in it to do my work as a VA disability lawyer. Anyway, I wonder though, were there projects that he passed up in order to build that facility because he valued something other than the dollar amount he would make doing the project? Okay. And if I didn't think there was a decent shot that the answer was yes, I wouldn't mention. That is something that shows that there are other values than how many projects can I get and how much dollars can I make building. Okay, but within our culture, though, that fatal materialism has taken hold. And so another aspect to it you see in a profession that you and I have been in, and you may still be in, and in fact, I'm actually still in, that's the profession of education. You will, well, let me back up. In 1960, if you went into the education profession, you did not enter it to make millions of dollars. You did not enter it to make half as much money as a doctor. You knew you were not going to be paid like a doctor is paid or a lawyer is paid, but you did it anyway because you valued the contribution you were making to society, because you valued and recognized the intrinsic worth and perhaps even the utility in instructing young, helping them think critically. And that's my nod to pedagogy that I agree with, so that those young minds could mature and then tackle the challenges that they faced or they would face in the future. Okay, and now fast forward, 62 years, which is scary. Fast forward from 1960, 62 years, and now why is the education profession hemorrhaging people? Okay, I submit that a significant part of the problem is because what I just said is not valued anymore. Because if that was valued the way Hemingway valued producing writing, people would still do it, even if they would go hungry, as it were, right? Something that I think Socrates would have respected, and perhaps even Plato would have respected. Because of course there's a noon in his name in Greek, and then I will save myself from embarrassment and not say more. But in French, c'est Platon. Still, it's Platon.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, I think he would have respected that also. I don't know about Aristotle, but I'm certain Socrates, and I'm willing to hazard also Platon. So anyway, yeah, I think, for leaders, decide first what you're not going to have an opinion on, okay? Second, it's going to sound so corny, but do unto others as you wish them to do unto you. So if somebody shows up and their partner is somebody you don't know from a sex you can't identify, fine. Hi, nice to meet you, and just interact like a normal person, okay? Use your judgment about what you might not wish to bring up. And I think you'll be able to get done more, okay? And I think people will respect you. I honestly think that in certain circumstances, people are showing up and they're not necessarily looking for a fight, but they're aware that they're bringing something to the table that other people aren't. Okay, fine. Just interact with them as you wish to be interacted with, and then move forward, When I look at the life of Jesus from a social interaction perspective, there were certain groups he was going to challenge them, period. And there were other groups, whole other groups. We don't hear anything, or we don't read anything if we don't hear it at all. We don't read anything in the 4 classic gospels contained in the normal Orthodox small O New Testament about him having an opinion on those things, or on those people. And I think that's marvelous. But here, and think of the book Jesus CEO, right? Which I haven't read, but just Jesus as a social interactor. Okay, fine. He's interacting with people, showing compassion. Okay, not going out of his way and insulting people, with very few exceptions. And then it was done on purpose because he was the Son of God bringing certain points. So anyway, if you're not the Son of God, don't bring those points. Go forward. Next. You're a leader. Great. You got a job to do. Wonderful. Assume your team is showing up with that same ethic. Lead them. Show them how to go. Provide the vision, okay? Assign the tasks, okay? Get the ball moving and stay out of the weeds. Stay out of what isn't your business. Now, one of the masterful things about this book, and I'm glad you wanted me to do this, because when you first mentioned it, I was not happy at all, because I like Owen Wilson and his acting. I have seen Owen Wilson in Paris in my life, okay? I have seen him on a bicycle in Paris with my wife, okay?
Okay.
And I liked his version of this. I thought it was well done. And anyway, the text itself, one of the things that impresses me is I think he does an excellent job of showing you the effect of Paris on a set of well-known people. For example, when he was talking about his walking route to avoid bakeries and restaurants, I know some of that route. I know from Jardin de Luxembourg to Saint-Sulpice. I can see it in my head. And when I was reading it, I could see it. It's brilliant. It's absolutely brilliant. Okay, it's brilliant.
By the way, you can tell he's better at French than I am.
The French speaker, he even taught French.
Right.
So I should hope, that he is. And yet, you're not seeing me doing human consulting and training.
That's true.
It's not my métier. It's not my bailiwick. It is not, what I do. He represented and reproduced so well Paris. It's delicious reading some of the passages in here, and I don't think you touched on what I thought was the best writing in here. I'm going to read it.
Oh,
It's
he's
last
going.
page or
The
page
guest is
151.
going. The guest is going to read. This is a reversal on the podcast, gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen. The
Yeah.
guest is going to read a selection from A Movable Feast.
One single dog-eared page in my reading and preparation, and this is what is on it. It's page 151. It's the end of the essay about the long essay about F. Scott Fitzgerald. Okay,
Yes.
and it precedes Hawks Don't Share.
It does.
Quote, we both, better back up. Quote, no, and after Pamplona, we'll go to Madrid and to Valencia. Close quote. Quote, I'm just going to stop with the quotes because it makes it harder to read. So, no, and after Pamplona, we'll go to Madrid and to Valencia, period. The next speaker is Hadley. She said softly, like a cat. Poor Scott, I said. Poor everybody, Hadley said. Rich feather cats with no money. We're awfully lucky. We'll have to be good and hold it. We both touched wood on the cafe's table, and the waiter came to see what it was we wanted. But what we wanted not, he nor anyone else, nor knocking on wood nor on marble at this cafe tabletop could ever bring us. But we did not know it that night, and we were very happy. And I loved that passage. I thought it was very well written and very evocative. Very much so. So yeah, that it's almost elegiac, and that definitely touched me. But I think he was onto something, And one of the aspects to touch on a previous question of yours, basically, how does a leader shepherd his talent or her talent? Because that's what you need to do. You need to shepherd your talent, or if you prefer a gardening metaphor, you need to cultivate the talent, a word that used to mean physically caring for and helping something grow. That's what you need to do with your talent. They recognize that you could also have something like success or luck or what have you, and that it came from somewhere. You may have it and it was fleeting, and thus it was precious, and you needed to cultivate it, and you needed to respect that this thing was there, and they seemed to get that. But what they did not, of course, know at the time, or perhaps it was only Hemingway who didn't know it, is, hey, you were actually happy. You may not have known it, but you were actually happy. And one of the great tragedies in the human experience is looking back on a period of happiness while presently not happy, and then the pain of recognizing judgment that you've squandered it, that you missed what actually mattered. So back to the construction, the man and the woman together running a construction company, that's their family's company. Don't miss the actual ball game. Spend some quality time with your kids. That's going to matter more. Do things that actually matter. Enjoy your lives, because that will help you contextualize work, contextualize leadership at work, and it will actually make your leadership more dynamic. To borrow a metaphor, and then I'm going to stop talking, to borrow a metaphor from writing, okay? Hemingway famously talked about what to leave out. And that's also a part of dynamic leadership and part of a dynamic speech, like JFK's inaugural. Know what to leave out. You're leading people, great. Know what to leave out. Don't over disclose, millennials or other people. And I'm a gush, so I get it. Don't over disclose. Okay? You're going to cheapen and dilute your leadership by over disclosure. Okay? It's hard to lead anybody on Twitter. It's not impossible. It's just hard. And what I would say is the people who actually are really effective on Twitter, ironically or not, they're the people who tweet infrequently, or they're the people who hyper tweet everything they're thinking, but it works because they're in a context where people aren't expecting. And that's why it works. Where they're expecting you to say a lot and, okay, doesn't work. It's when they don't expect you to say much, they don't expect to have access to you as an actual person, and all of a sudden you're there saying whatever. That's very powerful. Okay? Or where they're expecting you to just say whatever and you don't. You shepherd your talent, you mince your words so that you say what needs to be said and then you stop talking.
Stay out of the weeds. Don't over disclose. Provide the vision. Decide what you're not going to have an opinion on. And I think fundamentally subvert expectations of the environment you may happen to be. Whether that subversion is, oh, hi, you're showing up with this element to the game and you're the partner of a person I'm doing business with, acting as if, or whether you're subverting expectations in your Christian walk by merely just being the person next door who the gay couple can leave their key with, knowing that someone will walk their dog and will take care of their house.
Let's turn the screw. I want you to be that house where the runaway slave shows up and knows I will be protected because they're still out there.
Subvert
That's turning the
expectations.
screw.
Subvert expectations. Those are about 5 things that you need to do to stay on the path. And we've talked for a while with Dorollo here. This is one of our bigger episodes, but it's good because we're both verbose guys. And we have a lot of big points to make, and we talk in paragraphs, not tweets, which is why Dorollo doesn't do Twitter and why I rarely dip in and then dip back out again. We learned from Joan Didion that writers are always selling someone out through the act of writing and reporting. Leaders are always selling themselves out through acts of journaling and through what Dorollo has exposed here and what I've talked about here today, through incisive self-reflection. What we learned from Hemingway links to Didion's observations and it links those observations to the upcoming work of Jack Kerouac and John Steinbeck, and both On the Road and Travels with Charlie. Hemingway knows things about human nature, right? But he is loath to tell the truth about them in a direct fashion. He was the ultimate indirect reporter on human nature, and he demands that the reader infer, interpret, and engage with the facts as he has presented them, and then draw their own conclusions and make their own judgments. At the close here, in thinking about staying on the path of leadership, I'm going to quote extensively from the infamous Burning Platform memo, talk about providing the vision, written and released by the former, well, not released, it was leaked actually, by the former Nokia CEO, Stephen Elop, in 2011, when the Finnish mobile phone maker Nokia was being squeezed ruthlessly out of the mobile phone market by competitors Apple and Google, as well as other competitors down market in the supply chain, back when the supply chain was working fairly robustly. And I quote directly from the Burning Platform memo written by Stephen Elop. Hello there. There is a pertinent story about a man who was working on an oil platform in the North Sea. He woke up one night from a loud explosion which suddenly set his entire oil platform on fire. In mere moments, he was surrounded by flames. Through the smoke and the heat, he barely made his way out of the chaos to the platform's edge. When he looked down over the edge, all he could see were the dark, cold, foreboding Atlantic waters. As the fire approached him, the man had mere seconds to react. He could stand on the platform and inevitably be consumed by the burning flames, or he could plunge 30 meters into the freezing waters. The man was standing upon a burning platform, and he needed to make a choice. He decided to jump. It was unexpected. In ordinary circumstances, the man would never consider plunging into icy waters, but these were not ordinary times. His platform was on fire. The man survived the fall and the waters. After he was rescued, he noted that a burning platform caused a radical change in his behavior. We too are standing on a burning platform, and we must decide how we are going to change our behavior. Over the past few months, I've shared with you what I've heard from our shareholders, operators, developers, suppliers, and from you. Today, I'm going to share what I've learned and what I have come to believe. I've learned that we are standing on a burning platform. And we have more than one explosion. We have multiple points of scorching heat that are fueling a blazing fire all around us. For example, there is intense heat coming from our competitors more rapidly than we ever expected. Apple disrupted the market by redefining the smartphone and attracting developers to a closed but very powerful ecosystem. And then he proceeds to talk about specific internal Nokia practices and the competition. And then he picks up in the memo later, while our competitors poured flames on our market share, what happened at Nokia? We fell behind, we missed big trends, and we lost time. At that time, we thought we were making the right decisions, but with the benefit of hindsight, we now find ourselves years behind. The first iPhone shipped in 2007, and we still don't have a product that is close to their experience. Android came on the scene just over 2 years ago, and this week they took our leadership position in smartphone volumes. Unbelievable. We have some brilliant sources of innovation inside Nokia, but we are not bringing it to market fast enough. Then a little bit later on in the memo at the close, our competitors aren't taking our market share with devices. They are taking our market share with an entire ecosystem. This means we're going to have to decide how we either build, catalyze, or join an ecosystem. This is one of the decisions we need to make. In the meantime, we've lost market share, we've lost mind share, and we've lost time. How did we get to this point? Why did we fall behind when the world around us evolved? This is what I've been trying to understand. I believe at least some of it has been due to our attitude inside Nokia. We poured gasoline on our own burning platform. I believe we have lacked accountability and leadership to align and direct the company through these disruptive times. We had a series of misses. We haven't been delivering innovation fast enough. We're not collaborating internally. Nokia, our platform, is burning. Yep. In staying on the path, this is a perfect example, this memo, which was leaked and got Elop in some trouble. But that's what happens when you say the truth. It gets you in trouble.
Yep.
This is a perfect example of leadership self-awareness, incisiveness, and clear-eyed analysis. However, Nokia, a company, as Elop mentioned in his memo, led by a Soviet-style bureaucracy, according to a former employee in the early 2000s, was eventually sold to Microsoft. And after numerous financial wranglings and acquisitions and getting their turkey cut up over the last 20 years, currently sits at $4.82 per share. I looked this morning. Sometimes to stay on the leadership path, the path that used to be there must be destroyed so that a new path forward can be forged. By the way, Elop, who wrote this memo, later said this when he was asked about it, quote, the memo, was a very powerful statement of the reality of the situation without a lot of marketing polish on it. I think Ernest Hemingway would agree with that.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that's it for me. Dorollo, what do you have for us today?
I think that memo is brilliant, and I'd never read it before. And being me, I probably never even heard about it before. But anyway, obviously heard of Nokia and of Nokia's. I believe I've actually written about Nokia's failure to. Maybe it was Simon Sinek. Let's assume it's him. Someone has spoken very well about Nokia and their complete abdication of commercial leadership in the face of a change in paradigm, a change in reality that, as their former CEO identified, they just completely missed and then didn't recover. And of course, there are other ones too, right? I'm from Rochester, New York, and so the example that I go to often enough is the Eastman Kodak Company.
There you go.
Which helped make Rochester, New York what it is. That still has infrastructure there, that has a far greater presence and memory, though, than existing operations and infrastructure. But that was because they failed to recognize the moment they were in. And they thought that they could hoard new technology like digital photography, which started in the 70s, at least the 70s, if not earlier, and basically prevent you know, the competition from figuring out, hey, this is the new reality and we can control it or run with it. And, you know, that is also lack of leadership, lack of accountability, you know. A point that I wanted to make earlier also applies here. Okay, you asked me, I believe, how can leaders use their writing as a way to help the competition? And you help the competition by competing well and by competing fairly. So I'm not saying you disclose a business secret so that it will then force yourself to actually compete better. But what I am saying is that there will come moments in anyone's leadership where, like Cortez, you need to burn the ships. And he did that because he knew that they needed to forge a new way out, a new way forward. And that cannot happen if there's an escape route right there. And so he did something that today is unthinkable, that today would be criminal, not just because it's arson, not just because it's damaging the environment. Okay, we're part of political systems and political cultures that cannot look at that with admiration and a little trepidation. We don't look at it that way. We say, oh, that's terrible. What an unethical leader. No, what an actual visionary leader who recognized that he had literally come into something that is entirely different and requires something bold and innovating, and for which there is no reverse or reset button, millennials. There's no do-over, no reset button you can press. No, that's not how life works. So, and many of you, of course, know this, but within the common understanding of your culture, you don't. And where you're hampered is video games from when I was growing up have now taken on this multi-billion-dollar a year life of their own. And so you are now being conditioned to think of experiences having an off switch and a reset button, and they don't. So Cortez burned the ships. Okay, he was willing to do that, and it showed the power of his leadership, you know. And so what I find great about this memo is that was a Cortez moment. But the problem is, and I take it from the result, he didn't actually burn the ships. He didn't say, this is the new route we're taking and the consequences be damned. I'm just going to do this. And if I get fired, got my golden parachute, I'm good. But I will have gone out manfully, as Professor Mansfield would put it, Harvey Mansfield from Harvard, rightly so. Okay, gone out manfully, gone out the way Boabdil did not go out. Okay, the last Sultan of Al-Andalus and his own mom called him out on it. Okay, and so you're gonna go out, you better go out manfully, son. So,
are you going to come back either carrying your shield or on it?
Yes.
That's it.
Yes, that's how we used to function. And thankfully, there's still parts of the West that are functioning that way. That's why my wife still has a country called Ukraine. So there's still people functioning that way in the West.
Do you have anything you'd like to promote today? Any ways that we can stay on the path with Dorollo? Anything that you'd like to tell us about that you've got upcoming or that you've got floating around out there that you want us to pay attention to?
At the moment, no. At the moment, no. There are things I'm working on. There's projects I'm trying to realize. And so what's exciting about going through this stuff, and thank you, by the way, for this opportunity. I don't think I thanked you in the beginning, so I apologize. Thank you for this opportunity to be on your podcast. Thank you for letting me air my thoughts, both profound and nonsensical and things in between, in real time, most of the time, and certainly in recordable form. So I appreciate that, my dear friend Hassan. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this has been profound for me because it helps you think through, just at a minimum, the craft, you know, especially as a writer, the craft, you know, and just taking that seriously. When I was reading, it was either this or the Andy Dillard essay in The Writing Life, the first essay. I thought of the Western that I'm currently working on, which will actually probably end up being a novella rather than a novel. And why I say that is I'm looking at the drama that is there in the incidents of this man's life. And I'm saying to myself, okay, can I put enough in there and it still come out the way I think it ought to? It has a boldness, it has an abruptness, it also has a brevity, okay? Because the circumstances I know about the actual life of the man some of whose life I'm fictionalizing, they only cover a time frame of at most 20 years. And so is it possible to put that into a novel? Of course it is. You can do a novel about one day, dash James Joyce, dash.
There you go.
But, for the genre that I'm in, the Western, a novella might actually be better. And of course, Jim Harrison has written novellas about different aspects of American life in the West and done it extremely well. And of course, he's also written novels, wrote novels that were about different aspects of the conquering of the West, the enduring within the West of the Aboriginal and the shift in, those aspects. So what I'm doing, of course, is bringing into that it's not a forgotten chapter. It's more than that. It's the perspective of the Negro there, American Negro, who was there. The 10th Cavalry, they were there. And of course, the 10th Cavalry led by a man named Pershing, who of course would then lead American forces in World War I. And it's just, he actually had good things to say about the 10th Cavalry. So I'm trying to bring out some of these aspects as I live out my life and try to communicate that to my sons in the American West. So that's what I'm working on.
So when Dorollo drops that Western, we'll have him back on the podcast and we'll talk extensively. I mean, this has been almost 3 hours now. We've been talking. But
that means we're overdue for a phone call.
We're overdue for a phone call. That's what that means. Yeah, exactly. Well, we're both verbose guys, so I mean, there you go. No, we'll have him on to talk about the Western. I'm fascinated by the Western genre as a genre of literature. I'm also fascinated by how that genre of literature translates over to film, and I'm also equally fascinated with the rise and fall of the Western as a film genre. I actually fundamentally believe that many, and this would be another 4-hour conversation, but that many of the points that Dorollo makes about the science fiction genre can be applied to the Western genre in America as well. The loss of cultural confidence isn't just about what is out there. It's also many times about what is or what is not in here. From John Wayne all the way to Clint Eastwood, Charles Portis, all the way to Cormac McCarthy, and everything in between. So I want to thank Dorollo for coming on. I want to thank him for giving us his time and allowing us to hear from him and hear from me and allowing him to talk with all of you. If you'd like to stay on the path, I do have a few things I'd like to shill. You did hear the ad at the beginning of the podcast in regards to my new book out, 12 Rules for Leaders, the Foundation of Intentional Leadership, written with extensive contributions from Bradley Madigan. I would encourage you to go out and pick that up on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, and all of your major book retailers. I actually just got the note today that apparently you can get it on Walmart.com and Target.com. So there's that. You can also pick it up in libraries if you don't want to spend any money on it. I would encourage you to go out and buy the hardcover, buy the paperback, and of course buy the Kindle version, not because I'm looking for the money, although I'd be lying if I said I wasn't, but also I would encourage you to get it, to give it to a friend, hand it off to somebody who you know is about ready to explode into leadership. As I said before in my ad at the beginning of this podcast, getting that book is kind of like getting coaching from me without having to pay my full coaching rate. If you're an organization that wants to help managers and supervisors become better leaders, if you're the manager or the owner of that construction company and you like your managers and supervisors to become better leaders, we have products for that. Leadership Toolbox can be very helpful. These are remotely delivered, 12 remotely delivered webinars or 12 live delivered classes, in-person sessions that really focus around the development of leadership, right? Everything from conflict management all the way to leadership roles and responsibilities, all the way through adapting to change. These are designed to fill the toolbox of a manager so that they can move from being a hobbit, or someone who may think of themselves as a hobbit, even though they may not use that word, to someone who can be a giant in the land and lead your people to where they need to go. Check us out at leadershiptoolbox.us. If you don't have time for that, or you like a subscription service, or you like to drip this out to your employees, we also have our LeadingKeys, our software as a service platform, subscription only. You can go check that out at leadingkeys.com. Once again, 12 modules of content, including online guides, a forum where you can get direct engagement and coaching with me, and of course, plenty of resources there. Check that out at leadingkeys.com. By the way, if you want to go get the book, you can go on Amazon.com, Barnes & Noble, Borders, all those. Well, not Borders. Borders is out of business. You can go find Borders. Good luck to that. I have not found Borders yet. I've been looking for them for a while now, but definitely Barnes & Noble and Amazon. You can check that out. Just go put my name in, Hassan Sorrells, or you can look for 12 Rules for Leaders. You can also pick up the My Boss Doesn't Care book, my second book, My Boss Doesn't Care, 100 essays on disrupting your workplace by disrupting your boss, because maybe the boss of your construction company needs to be disrupted. Sometimes the leader has to be disrupted in a Soviet-style bureaucracy in order for the platform fire to be put out. And sometimes you are the only one that can do that. You're going to need that book as a guide. So check that book out. You can also listen to the rest of our podcasts. I would encourage you to check out the My Boss Doesn't Care podcast. The Little Red Book is now a Little Red podcast, so you can check that out twice a month, everywhere where you listen to podcasts. Also, my other podcast, which is a little bit more of a goofing around podcast, a little more casual, less polished, but that's where we have real conversations in raw kinds of ways. The Hassan Sorrells audio experience. This month, or the last couple of months actually, we've been talking about fatherhood and the dynamic between fathers and sons, the dynamic between fathers and daughters, and the dynamic between fathers and society, because leadership really does begin in the home. Check that out, the Hassan Sorrells audio experience, everywhere where you listen to podcasts. And of course, I would be remiss, my production team tells me this all of the time: like and share the podcast. If you've made it this far and you're at the end, go to Spotify, go to Google, go to Apple, hit that button. Even if you only give us 1 star and you're like, this is terrible, I would never read any of these books. Or you give us 5 stars and you're like, these guys are genius, more of this. This tells the aggregators that we're okay. This tells the AI processes that don't know who we are in Spotify and Google and in Apple that we're okay and that we should be pushed to the top of the heap with the big boy podcasts, some of which I could name and many of which I won't. So go leave us a review. Go tell us how we're doing. And of course, you can always send me an email, info@hsconsultingandtraining.com, or you can go on the Leadership Toolbox website and hit subscribe. And you can also send me an email there if you'd like to respond to the show. Once again, thank you to Dorollo Nixon for coming on with us today. Thank you for having us. And thank you for joining us. And with that, you have a great rest of your leadership day. I'm out.